Today we are going to continue our series entitled Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, which is based on a book by Andy Stanley of the same name. And if you're in one of our small groups in the church, you'll have the chance to discuss these issues during the following week. And let me just say that we're going to take a break midway through this series. This is the third in the series, and they're of 6. And so next week we're taking a little break, and we're going to have a different kind of Sunday meeting where there's a bit more emphasis given over to extended time of worship and various prophetic or kind of words of encouragement, scripture reading. So prepare your heart during this week. We sort of experimented a bit at the very beginning of the year when we did that. So this is what we're going to do, and that's going to be instead for this particular Sunday of a special cafe church. The next cafe church will be at the very beginning of April, but we will have a special twist to Eddie's Cafe on the the next day, which is the 14th of February, because it's Valentine's Day. So we're not going to do a cafe church on the 13th, but we will have a little extra special twist to Eddie's Cafe the next day because it's Valentine's Day. Not quite sure what it will be, but I know there are folk plotting and planning behind the scenes right now. And just let me give a plug for Eddie's. It's back on tomorrow, and so if the word is not clear yet, then please let everyone know Eddie's is on every week. So back to our series. And basically, the premise of this series is that I think we can all, if we're honest, agree with one another that at some point in our lives, we've almost certainly made decisions that were hasty or ill-advised or just plain wrong, and we wish we could go back and do a go-around, and I talked to you about that a couple of weeks ago, that phrase from the world of aviation, but of course, mostly we can't. And as I said, I'm talking about decisions that have important consequences and not, for example, what colour socks I'm going to put on in the morning. And when we have those regrets, again, this is the premise of the series, about a particular decision we have made, is often because we failed to ask ourselves a few key questions about why we were making that decision, which, had we done so, would probably have made a crucial difference. Now, those 5 questions, just to remind you, are the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself? We looked at that last week. The legacy question, which we're going to unpack today. What story do you want to tell or have told about what you just did? 3, the conscience question. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? 4, the maturity question. What's the wise thing to do? And 5, the relationship question. What does love require of me? Before I go any further, I want to remind you of a couple of important comments I made last Sunday. And the first one of those is that this series is not about raking up your past failures and making you feel bad. What is done, and God is always forgiving and redemptive. And if you're like me, there will be decisions that you've agonized over in the past and made the best fist of it that you possibly could at the time, and although later on you wonder if it was the right decision, you did your absolute best at the time. We're not going back to those, raking them up and trying to make anyone feel bad. And secondly, we're not suggesting that in some simplistic and reductionist way we can now guarantee perfect decisions going forward if only we answer these 5 questions honestly. That would be naive. So with those caveats, let's look at the legacy question this morning. And what that simply means, as I've already indicated, is each time we face an important decision, we need to ask ourselves, what story do we want to tell about what I just did, or have others tell about what I just did? You see, when you stop to think about it, our whole life is a story. Now, we may not always view it that way, but we all have a biography of our life. Of course, only some of those biographical lives, those biographies get published, but as far as God's concerned, every single person has a biography of their life. Now, I don't know about you, but I actually love reading biographies. It's one of my favorite genres of literature, especially very well-researched ones. Of course, they're generally about people who've become famous because they've achieved something incredible, or they've had a great career, or they're in the public domain for whatever reason. And I'm going to let you into a secret today, which I don't think I've ever said publicly in 40 plus years of ministry. It's not that revealing, but I'm going to tell you which part of the biography I really enjoy the most. The answer to that question, which part do I enjoy the most, is the early chapters. And the reason I love those early chapters is because I learn all sorts of things about people who later became famous, who got written about, and which I probably know quite a bit about, but never knew how they began. And one of the most fascinating aspects of those early chapters of good biographies is how the decisions that they made early on, or sometimes the decisions that were made for them, went on to have an impact on their emerging life story. So, for example, the fact that they were inspired by a particular teacher at school, which led them to have a real interest in that area, and they ended up being a world-famous scientist or something like that. But it was touch and go whether they were even going to make it through school. But there was a teacher that took a particular interest in them in the science club, and they started finding that was their passion. And, they went on. And you can see that early connection, that decision that maybe the teacher made to embrace that child, don't mean literally, but bring that child into the science club because they could see a spark of interest in them, and the decision of the child to go with that suggestion actually helped to bring them into the sphere that they later became famous for. Or that they moved to that company at that particular time, and it's just because the CEO was about to retire, they didn't know that, and various reshuffles took place, and suddenly they were sort of catapulted through the ranks, and then ended up, being the right place at the right time. In observing this in hindsight, it would perhaps therefore not be an exaggeration to say that their whole life story was the result of a succession of those kind of decisions. Just let that sink in a bit. So you could argue that, certainly up to a point, and I'm not leaving God out of this at all, that our life story is a succession, accumulation of a succession of decisions that are made, and that forms the narrative of our life. Which just shows you how important it is to ask ourselves, when we're facing a big decision over which we do have some control, what story do I want to tell about what I just did? Or what do I want others to say about what I just did? Now, I said in my introductory sermon 2 weeks ago that even when we do not have control over decisions that affect us, we mostly do have control, to a great extent, over our response to them, which will flow directly into the story that gets told about us subsequent to our response being made. So even when things happen to us, we mostly have control over our response to that, and that becomes our decision. And when we make that response, we need to ask the question, what story do I want to tell about what I just did? Now, to help us look at this from a biblical perspective, I want to tell you the story of a man who lived around 1800 BC, a man called Joseph. Now, you're probably very familiar with the story of Joseph, even if it's only through Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical. But you can find Joseph's story in the very first book of the Bible. And amazingly, it's the book of Genesis, of course, it takes up a large part of 13 chapters of that book, the last 13 chapters. So it's a very important story. It's given a lot of airtime, as it were, in the biblical big narrative, the meta-narrative. And I know that most of you will know this, but let me just give you the highlights to remind you if you know the story, and perhaps if you've never heard the story, let me just give you the key features of this story, because I think it brilliantly illustrates the very point that we're looking at this morning. So, as I said, long story, but the short version of that story is that a 17-year-old man called Joseph finds himself in a large family, and his older brothers, he's the youngest, deeply resent him. So he's the baby of the family, and his father has multiple wives, which is what was okay in those days. Wouldn't recommend it today. It's actually against the law. But so this baby of the family was the favorite son of the favorite wife. His father was called Jacob, of course. And so this was not good news for Joseph. Now, it does seem he got a little bit big for his boots, and not sure that he probably pulled his weight in the eyes of his older brothers, because if you read the story in the book of Genesis, you'll find that he wasn't quite sure even where they were when he went to visit them, when they were looking after the sheep. So maybe he was a bit young to do that, but then they did work quite hard at quite early ages. So the impression is given in the story implicitly, not explicitly, that he probably never went there very much. He was probably his mother's favorite. She helped him around the house. So you can see the picture. So here is a guy who's known great favor of his parents, but great resentment of his brothers. Now sadly, that resentment boils and boils and boils until it boils over. And in their consuming jealousy, they decide one day they've had enough of this little upstart, this obnoxious little person who actually, by the way, came out to the fields to tell them that he was going to be so important and they were going to bow down to him, which did not go down well. It was not the way to win friends and influence others. And they kind of snapped and they said, that's enough. You've had enough of this arrogant little runt of the litter kind of thing, and I'm just being very honest, this is the kind of picture that's being painted in the Bible. So they decide they're going to kill him. So a bit drastic, but fortunately they lose their nerve. A couple of the brothers talk them out of that rather dastardly plot, so they decide instead, if they can't kill him, they're going to sell him to some passing slave traders, which is what they do. And they go home and they tell their parents that, sadly, Joseph has been killed by a wild animal. And they fabricate some animal blood on the coat that he used to wear. And, of course, his parents are devastated. And now those 10 older brothers, with that big fat lie that they've created, have to live with a devastating secret for probably the next 20 years. As best as we can work out the timeline. Now, there are consequences for every decision. In this case, their terribly bad decision caused them to live with a big fat lie for 20 years. Now, there was a nice little twist at the end, and it all came good, as you probably know. But 20 years, can you imagine 20 years? Having to cover up the fact that this is what you did, telling your parents that it was the wild animals that got him. Well, Joseph ends up at a slave auction where an Egyptian military officer called Potiphar, who turns out to be the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, purchases him as a domestic slave. And, of course, slavery at that point was quite common, quite normal. It was just part of the economic system of the ancient world. And so now Joseph has gone from being the favorite son of the favorite wife to being a domestic slave in a foreign country. So he now has a crucial decision to make. What does he do in this awful situation? Does he perhaps try and escape? Maybe do as little work as possible around the house with as stinky as attitude as he can get away with? Or what? Well, what the Bible tells us is that what he actually does is to work hard and to serve his new master so well As a result, he ends up, kind of in modern language, effectively becoming the butler of the household. Now, if you like Downton Abbey, or even if you don't like Downton Abbey, you will know that kind of the butler is one of the key, probably the key, male servant in the sort of old households of the Victorian Edwardian era. So he ends up second only to his master. You see, he could have said, "This is my story. I was a victim of my brother's terrible jealousy. I was kidnapped, sold twice, and enslaved." Which is all true. But the last bit is the crucial bit. He must have said, bear in mind now, we're looking at this filter, what story do I want to tell about what I just did? He must have said, "But I chose not to live as a victim." He was a victim of his brother's terrible jealousy, kidnapped, sold twice, and enslaved, but he must have said to himself, "I do not want to tell this story from the perspective of a victim." Now, let me just make clear at this point that this is not a commendation of slavery. It's merely, a learning key principle through the life of a major biblical character who lived in that ancient culture. But back to the story. Despite that incredibly noble response, he's soon facing another huge problem. By now, he's, we guess, around 19 or 20, and he's actually a handsome guy. The Bible particularly points it out. Genesis 39, verse 6, says he was a handsome guy. And Potiphar had a wife who clearly had some, and I'm reading this between the lines, but I think it's fair to say, had some inadequacies in her marriage. Maybe her husband was always away, working at the palace. Maybe he didn't care very much for her, I don't know. But she starts making sexual advances to Joseph. Young man, handsome young man, husband busy at work, and so basically she tries to seduce him. Now, poor old Joseph is in a terrible dilemma here. He's got to make another big decision and is kind of doomed whichever way he goes, because if he goes and gives in to her advancements, it's going to end badly. It's almost certainly going to end badly. But equally, look at the flip side. If he resists her advancements, she's his master's wife, and it's probably going to end badly even if he does that. And so he's in this incredible dilemma of what decision to make. But the Bible tells us quite specifically that he takes time to think about the story he wants to tell about this next bit in his life. Because if you go to Genesis 39, don't have to do it now, but you will see that he explains to Potiphar's wife the story to this date. He says, "I was a slave, I had been sold, I ended up here, your master has been kind to me, I have worked hard, he has empowered me, he has given me everything in this household, he has withheld from me nothing except his wife," which of course is absolutely correct. And he says, why would I, basically, I'm summarizing, he said, why would the next chapter in this story be, I betrayed my master and sinned against my God? See how he's rehearsing the story to date, and he's saying this doesn't look like a good next chapter in it. And I would like to suggest that in doing that, he's actually also appealing to, hopefully, a better side of Potiphar's wife, which doesn't appear to be there, actually, but he's really saying to her, do you want to spoil the next chapter of your life? You are the wife of the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. You're in the royal household. You're a very important person. and you are favored by Pharaoh, do you really want the next chapter of your life story to be, and I had an affair with a Hebrew slave? But sadly, as you know, she didn't listen to that good advice, and she keeps pestering him. The Bible says she keeps on and on and on. And then one day, when they're in the house alone, she tries to grab him and basically shove him into bed. Joseph has no choice but to run away. But in doing so, she manages to grab his cloak and then makes up a completely trumped-up charge to cover what's just happened, and ends up twisting the story completely that she had to protect herself against this sexual predator, and she persuades her husband to deal with it very severely. He's outraged, of course, and what happens is Joseph ends up no longer being second in command of the household. He ends up in the king's prison. Now, at this point, you and certainly I may well have been tempted to say, let's just give up and say it's hopeless. I'm just cursed with bad luck, whatever I do. And I say that because in life there are sometimes seasons when it seems like you appear to be the victim of lots of decisions that are made about you, which you feel are unjust, even though you've done the right thing as best as you know how to, and you kind of think, it's pointless. What's the point of trying to make good decisions? What is the point? The key reality in those moments of pain is to remember that the story isn't over. As you know, if you know the story, Joseph's story was far from over. And the key point is, neither is your story or my story. Because every day we write another small chapter of our story of life on this earth, and that doesn't end, that story of life on earth, until the day we die. Now, of course, we have a life beyond that with the Lord, but I'm saying the story of our life on earth doesn't end until the day we die. And just being very personal again, I can remember, as many of you will know, a particularly dark week when Carol had cancer a few years ago, and the doctors were preparing me for the worst, and I didn't know if there would be another day in Carol's life, because sepsis had set in and it was looking very bleak. And I just went back to God and cried out to God, and I actually remember saying to God, through my tears, God, this is not over until it's over. And so I'm going to keep on praying on those promises that you gave me, and many of you will know what those particular scriptural promises were. And I said, until there's no more breath in my body, I'm going to keep praying those promises. And then, of course, she's still here. She's sitting in the front row, looking as lovely as ever. So the story wasn't over. So Joseph, bless his heart, makes another incredible decision to do in the king's prison, just what he did in Potiphar's household. And do you know what? He ends up being second in command to the chief jailer. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? Again, let me just make a crucial point, because it doesn't always become obvious. It isn't always obvious if you just read the story quickly until you've done the maths and worked out the timeline here. This went on for years. I'm calculating maybe as much as 10 years, many as 10 years. So if I was Joseph, I'd say, look, Lord, I made this decision that the story that's going to be told about what I've just done is Joseph he wowed them. He was amazing. He didn't become bitter. He didn't become cynical. He didn't give up. And in a year's time, the Lord released him. But he didn't. And the second year, and the Lord released him after 2 years of faithful service in the prison. And he didn't. And this went on for 10 years. And let me just explain what I think is the key to how that was possible, and how it might be possible for us when we kind of feel trapped into something that wasn't really of our making, and yet we've chosen the right decision because of the story we want told about what we just did. In Genesis 39, verse 23, it says this very, very specifically. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's oversight, and this is the bit I want to emphasize, this next bit, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. And this links, I think, very clearly to what Paul was talking about. And I want to link it back to a comment that's a bit earlier in that chapter, which I've quoted already, or paraphrased, quote, when Joseph was resisting the advances of Potiphar's wife, he said, "Why would I sin against my God?" So you put those two verses together, and they're only in the same chapter, they're only a few verses apart. Joseph, in the midst of all that has happened to him, is more concerned about what God thinks than anybody else. And that speaks to me of a man who is walking closely with God, even in the most dreadful situation, in one sense, away from his family, in a distant country, doing a job he'd never signed up for, but he is so much aware of the fact that he's responsible for his actions before God Almighty. And because of this, look at the quid pro quo of this. Look at what's on the other side of this coin. And because of that attitude in Joseph, quote, the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. And I think that is a biblical principle. I'm not saying it's simplistic. I'm not saying you can just use it as a promise box verse. But I think as we put God at the very center of our life story, we can truly believe that the Lord is with us, and in whatever we do, he will prosper us. Now, that prosperity may look a bit different to the world view of prosperity, but nevertheless, we are prospering spiritually and in God's economy. Now, after a long time, 2 other important prisoners are sent to the prison, and in due course, Joseph meets them and has to look after them. And one of them is the king's cupbearer, Pharaoh's cupbearer, and the other one is his personal baker. He's obviously got very annoyed with them, and because he's Pharaoh, he can do whatever he wants, he sent them off to prison. And one night in prison, each of them has a dream, different dream, but they've no idea what the dream means. They're very troubled about that, and so the next morning, Joseph realizes they're out of sorts, and he says, what's wrong? They both explain they've had this dream, but they don't know what it means, but they know it's important. So Joseph, with God's help, interprets the dream. And making a long story short, it's good news for the cupbearer, and it's bad news for the baker. So if you want to make a career decision, become a cupbearer, not a baker. No, I'm just kidding. So 3 days later, what happens is the cupbearer is restored to his official royal role, just as Joseph prophesied, and the next day, same day, baker is hanged. Now, it gets, almost more and more unbelievable. Joseph, having done this amazing favor, specifically asked the cupbearer to put in a good word for him with Pharaoh. Not unreasonable, is it? He just got him out of prison, and he's restored to fortune. And, of course, the cupbearer is basically shoremate. And then completely forgets it. Doesn't do a thing. And now, there's no lucky break for Joseph, no change of fortune, and it's another 2 years before anything changes. And all I can say is I'm absolutely staggered at the faithfulness of Joseph, who refused resolutely to become cynical, resentful, to throw away his faith, to give up on God. But I just don't know how he did it, except for the grace of God. But I think his story is in the Bible, and it's given so much time, so much airtime, because of that reality, that even looking at his life story, he kept saying, I don't want to spoil the next chapter of this story because the story is not done until it's done. Yeah. And while I've still got breath in my body, the story is still going on. Well, you know what happens, and I'm coming into my sort of final descent now. One day the king, Pharaoh, has a dream which nobody can interpret. And then suddenly, finally, the blooming cupbearer remembers this guy in prison who did interpret dreams for him. So he mentions it, probably a bit embarrassed, probably a bit, I should have said something a bit earlier. And of course, he gets summoned to the palace, and we're told specifically he had to be spruced up, so probably had equivalent of a shower and a shave, and he's brought before Pharaoh. This is amazing. I mean, Pharaoh, these guys are tyrants, they're autocrats, they have absolute power. So, this isn't a kind of a nice little office complex. This is the palace. He is going before the most powerful man in the whole region, and everyone is terrified of him. And he's in a bad mood because he's got this dream and he doesn't know what it means. So he explains the dream. Joseph, like Daniel, giving full acknowledgement to the fact that he cannot interpret the dream, but God can. See how, again, this thread keeps coming out of his walk with God, his faith in God, his belief in God. So like Daniel, he says, I can't do this, but I know God, and God can. So he explains the dream, and you know how the story goes of the 7 years of great harvest, the 7 years of famine, and he says, this is what it means, O king, and then he does something that nobody ever does. He gives unsolicited, major national policy advice to the king. Now, you don't do that. If you were in the court in those days, you always waited to be invited. You always waited for the king to ask your opinion. You did not volunteer your opinion. But Joseph doesn't just volunteer his opinion. He gives him the entire strategy and tells him that this is what you need to do, and you need to find somebody to trust to do it. And so I would say this, that Joseph's deep humility before God certainly did not rob him of courage. And there is no incompatibility with a deep humility and great courage. In fact, I would say that one builds on the other. It's that deep humility, and we've heard about it from Paul, that means that you know you're dependent upon God, that gives you that great faith and courage to say, with God, nothing is impossible. And so the king amazingly does exactly what Joseph tells him to do, and Joseph ends up effectively as the kind of prime minister of Egypt. And there are 7 years of tremendous plenty, and they have a plan and a strategy to gather in harvest and to allocate some to a grain supply for the future and so on and so forth. And then, just as he predicted, there are 7 years of famine. And it's in those years of famine that the final part of Joseph's story reconnects to its beginning. But let me back up just a minute before I come to the final point I want to make. Can you see, looking back, using Paul's analogy, can you see from the height of the eagle looking over the whole picture? Can you see how God was preparing over 13 years? In fact, this is now probably 20 years. From when he was 17, he's probably now about 37. Can you see how God was preparing Joseph to come to the place for which he was destined? So he ended up ruling Egypt, which was a superpower in those days. But in order to be prepared sufficiently, in God's amazing way, which doesn't make any sense to us and definitely shouldn't have made any sense to Joseph going through it, God decided that the best training program for becoming Prime Minister of Egypt was to become assistant to the chief jailer, and the best preparation for that was to become the butler of the household of the captain of the guard, and then be lied about with trumped-up charges and thrown in the prison, which he ended up being second in command of. I mean, you wouldn't make it up, would you? If you went to the careers advice officer in your school and said, I want to become Prime Minister of England, what is the best way of becoming... You would not have had that advice. And so God does move in mysterious ways his wonders to perform. He does know what he's doing, even if to us it seems a crazy pathway. But remember, the story is not at the end until it is the end. There's always another chapter to write. And so quickly, coming to land, Joseph's brothers come from Israel to Egypt to buy grain. It's a vast area that's affected by this famine. Remember, they've lived with this lie for 20 years. They have no idea what happened to Joseph. They've written him out of their lives, and there's a whole fascinating story that I haven't got time to go into about how they come a couple of times and he doesn't reveal himself the first time, but eventually all is revealed and they are absolutely petrified. He is now the prime minister of Egypt, which has all the grain. He can do whatever he wants, and they think they're probably in for the chop. Now it's payback time. Ha ha ha. Now it's payback time. But Joseph was not like that. We've already seen how he kept making godly choices again and again and again to make sure that the next chapter of his life story turned out well. He wanted people to tell a good story about what he just did. So he basically forgives them. He brings his whole family to Egypt to look after them and keep them safe. And that's the story of Joseph, which almost 4,000 years later we're still talking about, which is why the writer to the Hebrews names Joseph as one of the heroes of the faith. So as we put our seatbelts on to land, let me just encourage you. This is a really important question to ask. And it's even more important to remember and remind ourselves that often we have to make these decisions without much warning, or maybe without any warning. And so to know in advance the answer to the question, what do I want people to say in the future about what I just did? If we know in advance the answer to that question, then when we're faced particularly with unexpected decision making, we have much more likelihood of making the right decision.